Alright, what's up guys? So in this tutorial series I'm going to be showing you how to do JSON Web Token authentication, and this is going to be a very similar series to one that I already have, which is JSON Web Token authentication with the HTTP only cookies. So in that particular series what I did was I had a Next.js project and a Django backend API, and then that is the sort of tech stack I showed how to accomplish this sort of thing where you store your access and refresh tokens inside of a cookie that's going to have the HTTP only flag set to true, which means that JavaScript can't access the value. So in this series, the main difference is going to be the way that I structure the project itself. Instead, I'm going to show how to accomplish this with an Express server, which is serving the React client. And then again, for my main backend API, I'm going to be using Django with the Django REST Framework, just having more RESTful API. In case if you don't know, the Django REST Framework just builds on top of Django because Django is meant to work very well with the whole template model view sort of approach. And then the Django REST Framework allows Django to be more of a RESTful API. So it has views to sort of help kind of have more that approach. And then another thing that's going to be a little bit different in this series. So in the last series that I was just mentioning, I had Redux set up. So that was for the global state management. Except in this tutorial series, I'm going to be using Redux as well, but instead I'll be showing how to use the Redux Toolkit. So that's the more recommended approach currently, so I'll be showing how to do that. Alright, so this is going to be the project that I'll be showing you how to build. So relatively straightforward, but believe me, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So we have just a very basic homepage, and then a login and a register. And then also I'm going to open up my console, and then here I'm getting some 400 bad requests. That's perfectly fine. This is just a verify endpoint. And then if this fails, that means that we can't retrieve our user. So the whole idea behind this is if I refresh the page, if there is an access token inside of a cookie, then we're going to be able to verify and retrieve the user. So right now, we're going to go ahead and register for an account because currently I have no accounts. And then I'm going to set a password of password. I'm going to click register. And now this is going to fail. So I'm going to have some pretty nice approaches to doing the validation for the data. And then here we get error data, which here we see password. This password is too common. So then we're going to have some stuff like that. Also, if I were to do something like this on the front end, I'm going to have this kind of showing up like this, because this is an input of type email. But if, let's say, I were to use something like Postman and send this off, then there's also going to be some checking to make sure this is in an email format. So you're going to see all that sort of stuff. And then I'm going to set a better password here. And now I'm going to get redirected to the login. And then also we have this DevTools extension, which lets us see our Redux state as well as the different dispatches. So this is all the dispatch types that Redux Toolkit is generating for us. So here we have some asynchronous action creators. So we have a pending, fulfilled. We're going to go through all of this sort of stuff. So right now, if you've never used Redux Toolkit, this will look very confusing. But the whole point is that right now in our global state, once we registered an account, these are our current states. So is authenticated is still false because we have to log in. We don't have a user yet because we have to log in. Loading is false, registered. So this is just something that I see if someone registered successfully on the register page. This will get set to true so that we redirect to the login page. And then once we hit the login page, then we go ahead and set this back to false. And then loading is just to help us know, are we currently making some kind of asynchronous request? If so, let's show a loader instead of the button. So right now, I can go log in with that account. I'm gonna set the password. And then if I open up my application, so here I have a cookies tab on this domain, which is localhost 5000. So this is my Express server that's running on localhost 5000. And then that is serving this React app. So now I can click on login and I get redirected to the dashboard. And then here you can see in the cookies, I have a refresh and an access token. And then I can expand this out a little bit. And then we can see the HTTP only flag is set to true, and we can see some other stuff here as well, like the domain, the path, when it expires, all that sort of stuff that's done with cookies. So because I have an access and a refresh token, I can do things like retrieve my user, and then I can also refresh the page. I'm still logged in. So that was with that one thing I showed inside of the console that was showing up as a 400 bad request. Right now, we don't see that anymore because we are verifying successfully with the access token that we have. And then also here I have this auth check auth and then pending and fulfilled. So this is what's responsible for making that sort of request to verify our access token. If it's verified, then we go ahead and we retrieve the user details. And then we go ahead and just display them on this dashboard. And then also inside of my state, right now I see is authenticated true. I have my user data, so John Doe and the email, and then these other fields as well. So we're gonna go ahead and see how we could build something like this. And of course I can also log out where I get redirected to the login page. All right, so I'm gonna now stop running this. So I have a second screen, so I'm just gonna kill these terminals. So that was just to show you the project. All right, and now I'm gonna whip on back to this screen. So yeah, I have dual monitors because I am fancy like that. So I have another, I guess, desktop open because in macOS you can do this fancy stuff with desktops, and you can do the same thing on Windows as well. So right now I have VS Code open, and then I opened up a folder called Auth site. So this is where I'm going to be building this project. So first thing I'm going to do is create, say, my backend folder. I'm going to open up a terminal. Also, I guess I could zoom in a little bit since I am recording a video right now. Then I'm going to navigate into my backend. So this is where I'm going to be setting up my Django backend API. So I'm just going to be setting up my JSON Web Token authentication and all that good stuff. So I'm just going to do the basic boilerplate for now. So first thing I'm going to do is Python 3 -m venv and venv. So this is how you can create a virtual environment, and it's going to be inside of a folder called venv. So this way, instead of having the Python packages on my global system, I can just have them be inside of this virtual environment where then I can have a specific Python version with specific package versions that are more related to the project itself. Then I can activate the virtual environment with source venv bin activate. So right now I'm going to see this thing here, which means I'm in my virtual environment. And then if you're on Windows, you would just do something like /scripts bin, and then activate or activate.bat, something like that. And then I'm gonna clear this out, and then I'm gonna need to pip install Django. So this is gonna give me my Django framework. So right now I can do pip freeze, and then I can see these are the only packages I have right now inside of my virtual environment. I can also do things like Python version. So right now I don't have to do that Python 3 anymore like I did when I was outside of the virtual environment. So right now, if I just run that, I can see the version of Python that's being utilized inside this virtual environment, which is 3.10.4 in my particular case. So right now, since I have Django, I can create a Django project. So I can do that with Django-admin, start project, then the name of the project, which I'm going to call Auth site. And then I'm going to place this project in the current working directory. Click enter. So now this backend folder, going to have auth site, which is my project. It's going to have the virtual environment and this manage.py. So in this project, I'm going to have one app, which is going to be to manage my sort of authentication. So it's going to be Python manage.py start app is how I create the app, and I'm going to call it users. It's going to go ahead and do that. So now I have this in here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a custom user model, because by default, you're going to be registering with a username and password. I want to be doing an email and password. So that's one thing I'm going to be doing. And then also because I'm going to have JSON Web Token authentication, I'm also going to need some packages. So maybe that's the first thing I'm going to do. So pip install. First of all, I want Django REST Framework, just so I can have this library here as well on top of Django to give me the extra functionality for the different views that are meant to more function in a RESTful API approach. I'm also going to have Django REST Framework - simple JWT. I'm going to grab both of these things. And let's see. Before I do the custom user model, I'm just going to do some of these settings. I'm going to open up my settings pie. And then inside of my installed apps, I'm going to need REST Framework. And that's all I'm gonna put here for now. I'm also gonna need some settings. So by the way, if I search up Django REST Framework, you can actually see some of these things you have to set. So right here in their documentation, how you install it. So when I did pip install Django REST Framework, this is where that came from. And then you put this in your installed apps. And then you can also set this in your URL patterns. So if you're intending to use the browsable API, then you're gonna put this in there. I'm not gonna be using the browsable API, so in my case, I won't be doing this. And then you can also set different settings. So here you would just do that with this REST framework, and then that's gonna be a dictionary, where then you can do things like set permission classes and authentication classes, stuff like that. All right, so if I go back, I'm gonna just scroll to the bottom. Also, by the way, for the database, I'm just gonna be using the default SQLite 3 database just to keep the database set up nice and simple. And then right at the bottom, I'll add my REST framework setting. Oops, that's gonna be my dictionary. And then as for what even are the default values in REST framework, so you can actually even see that if you open up your virtual environment, lib, and then you can find your REST framework package, find the settings pie, and then here you're gonna see the default settings. So we have things like our default renderer classes, parser classes, authentication classes. So here you can see session authentication and basic authentication are what's in here, but we're gonna want JSON Web Token authentication, so we're gonna have to adjust that. You also have default permission classes of allow any, which I'm okay with. I'm just gonna keep that. And you have other things here as well. So that's how you can see some of your default settings in case if you're curious. I'm just gonna close that up now. And then how do I set inside of my default authentication classes, how do I set my new authentication class that I want to use? Well, for that, I can open up the documentation for Django REST Framework, simple JWT. So right here, I have the documentation, and then you can see what sort of things you have to set up. So here's a bunch of the different settings that you can set. And then also on getting started, they have how you install this thing. So that's where I got that install command from. And then also here you can see what you have to do. So inside of the REST framework setting, you set default authentication classes, and then you want to place this inside of there. So REST framework, simple JWT authentication, JWT authentication. So by the way, in this tutorial series, one thing I want to kind of do is utilize a lot of documentation going back and forth instead of having more prepared code that I'm kind of just going through, just to show a more realistic way of how you might develop an application. So hopefully that should be interesting for you guys. I'm just gonna plop this in here. And then after I place this in here, then you can also see what you have to do inside of your URL patterns. So there's different views. So they have a token obtain pair view, they have a token refresh view, and they're also setting up paths for these things. Then they also show how you can do the verify view right here. And then you can also place this inside of your installed apps. So if you wish to use localizations, translations, simply add this in your installed apps. I don't plan to use that, so I'm not gonna place it. And then we also have settings, which is another interesting thing you might wanna look at. So right here, you can set a simple JWT setting, which is gonna be your dictionary. And then these right here are the defaults. So some of the defaults that are interesting are auth header types, which by default is going to be bare. So when you add your authorization header, you're going to have the bare as the auth header type, and then you're going to put in your access token after that. So that's when you're making your authorized requests with the JSON Web Token authentication. So I'm okay with that default. You also have other things like access token lifetime, refresh token lifetime. So the one thing I'm going to change is the access token lifetime, just because by default, it's set to be 5 minutes, which I think is a little bit too short. So this is a setting I'm going to adjust, and everything else I'm really happy with the defaults. So I'm going to go back here and then do simple JWT. So just like how they show here, simple JWT. So make sure their spelling is exact. I'm just going to paste this in here. So right now I need to bring in time delta. So I'm going to go to the top of this file, do from datetime import time delta. So that's where that function is coming from. I'm going to go all the way back down. And then instead of having minutes equals 5, I'm going to do something like 30 minutes. I think that's pretty reasonable. So that way I don't have these access tokens expiring every 5 minutes, because that would be a little bit annoying. So this is good for these settings. So now the next step would be to go into my urls.py. And then we have to set up the URLs for the simple JWT. So if I go to the getting started, that's where we saw these things. So I'm going to have to import these things. So these are the views that come from this library. I'll place them right over here. And I might as well just put them in one line. So just like that. And then I'm also going to grab the token verify view. All right, so I'm bringing in all of these views, and then I'm going to set up the paths for these. So I'm just going to grab these two and just plop them right in here. I'm going to go back, grab the verify view, back to my code, and plop that in there. So I'm just going to use what they use as the default route. So API token slash, API token refresh slash, and verify slash, and that's what I'm going to have here. And then also they have these names set here. I'm not really going to need the name parameter here. So I'm just going to remove that because I won't be making use of that. So this is the way I'm going to have that set up. All right, so the next thing that we're going to have to do, so right now, the simple JWT library doesn't give us any logic for doing things like registering an account or retrieving our account, so we're going to have to implement that logic. So that logic is going to be implemented here inside of this user's app. This is where I'm managing things around my user model. And then the first thing I'm going to need to do is actually create a custom user model. So, like I said, I'm going to be using a lot more going back and forth with documentation just to give you a more realistic approach of how you would do these sorts of things if you're actually developing. So I'm going to look for Django and Google. I'm going to do -movie just so I don't have the Django Unchained movie showing up in my results. So by the way, it's something you can do in Google. You can do this minus and then have any keywords you don't want showing up. So then I can just click on Django, go to the documentation section. And then here I'm going to look for something like authentication. And then what I want to see is customizing authentication in Django. That's what I'm interested in. And then in this particular area, if you actually go to the very bottom of this page, there's going to be a full example that they show. So right here, you're going to be looking for a full example, and that kind of shows you how you go about doing this. So inside of my models.py, I'm going to bring in this import, first of all. Just going to remove this comment. I will need this right here. And then also I'm going to just have everything on one line because it's how I prefer to do it. And then the first thing I'm going to have is the sort of manager, which is going to inherit the base user manager. So they called that, I believe, my user manager, but I'm going to use a different name for that. I'm just going to call it user account manager because I like that name a little bit more. And then it's going to inherit this base user manager. So this base user manager has a bunch of things inside of here, and some of them we want to overwrite. One of them is the create user method. So this is going to take in self and then the parameters. So to create a user, I want to be utilizing a first name, last name, email, and password. So I'm going to have first name, last name, email, and password equals none. So inside of their example, they're doing email and date of birth and password. So that's the way that they're creating an account, but I don't want to do it that way. I'm going to do it the way I showed. And then they have if not email, they raise a value error. Then they have the users equal to self.model where they pass the email, self.normalize email, then the other required parameters. And then if you go down, they're passing date of birth because that's one of the required fields. So we're going to get more into this. This is the actual user model. And then this right here is what lets you do certain things, which I'm going to go into a little bit more once we get to that. First thing I want to do is just copy this part, go back to my code, and just paste this in here, fix up my indenting. All right, so if an email is not provided, we'll go ahead and raise this value error. Users must have an email address. And then here we're doing user self.model. And then what I'm going to do is email is equal to self.normalize email email. And then I'm just going to pass it in like this. And then another thing I want to do is email.lower, just to make it all lowercase, because this normalized email, if let's say you have something like an email of johndoe@gmail.com, what this normalized email is going to do, and I accidentally opened up a terminal, so I'm just going to exit out of that. So if you have something like this, once it goes through this function, it's going to look something like this. So johndoe@gmail.com. So there's a normalized email. We'll just normalize sort of this part of the email, but this is going to remain in all uppercase, which I don't really want. So I'm just going to do the email.lower. And then I'm also going to need some other things provided here. So first name equals first name. Last name is last name. And then email is email. And then they do this user.setPassword password. So this is going to hash the password. Then we're going to do a user.save. They pass this using equals self._db. And then they return the user. So that's the return from this method. All right, so that's the first step. After that, there's a create super user. I'm just going to grab this create super user, plop it into here, fix up the indenting. I'm going to create the documentation section. And then this, for our super user, we're going to be taking in a first name, last name, email, and then password none. And then we're going to call the create user method. So that's this right here. And then what we're going to pass to that is going to be, of course, the first name, last name, email, and password. So that's what we're passing to this here. And that's going to return the user, which is going to be saved in the database. And then we're going to set the isAdmin flag to true, and then go ahead and save that once again and return the user. So they're using an isAdmin flag, but that's not something I particularly want. So by default, the user model, it's going to have an isStaff flag. So if that is set to true, then you can log into the admin panel of Django. So the admin panel is just this right here, which gets rendered when you go to the admin/routes. And then if we have isStaff, then we can log into there. And then in order to make changes to the data in there, I have to set the isSuperUser flag to be true. So that's going to allow this user to not just log in there, but actually make changes to the data. So that's how you can make a proper super user. And then from there, I'm going to create the custom user model. So this was the user manager. Right now I'm going to do the model. So I'm going to call it user account. And then this is going to inherit from abstract base user. And then when we're doing things like dealing with the super user, one thing we have to do is also bring in permissions mixin, and then also inherit that. So that's another thing I'm going to inherit on top of the abstract base user. And then here I can define the different fields I'm working with. So things like first name is models.character field. And I'm going to set a max length to this of 255. I'm going to have a last name, email. And then the email, it's going to be an email field. If I can spell, there we go. And then I'm also going to want this to be unique. So I'm going to set the unique parameter to true. So I can go back to the documentation. So you can see how here they have a class of my user. They inherit abstract base user. Then they have this right here where they're setting their email, models.email field. They're also passing this verbose name, so I'm not going to pass that. They also have unique true. They have their date of birth field is active, so I'll go ahead, grab that. By default, I want the is active flag to be true. So this is active flag is another thing that's part of this user model. And then I might also show like actually what all these fields are, but I'm gonna have to do that a little bit later. So is active, and then I'm also gonna have is staff, which by default will be false. Then if I go back, we're also gonna have this objects that we have to set. So this is an attribute, which I'm gonna set to my user account manager, which I set up right here. So this objects thing, this is something you see all the time. So if I were to bring in my user model, I can do things like user.objects.filter, where email is email. So this objects thing is this right here. And then we're going to have access to things like filter and get and so forth because we're inheriting from base user manager. It has all these things. But the main difference is that our user account manager, we just wanted to override things like the create user and create super user. So we can also do things like user.objects.createUser. And then now this create user is going to be this create user because we overwrote the default, which would be taking in that username and password. So that's what this objects thing is. So now we also have username field and required fields. So I'm going to grab that, paste that in here. So username field is going to be the field that you log in with. Required fields are going to be the other fields you require in order to actually create the account. So in my case, I'm going to have first name, and last name. There we go. Then I can also define the string representation of this model. So that way, actually first I'm just going to return self.email. So this is just a Python thing so that when we see the object representation of this, it doesn't look something like objects 0x, whatever it shows up usually when you like print out, say, the user model. Instead, we're just going to see it printed as whatever email is attached to that. And then you can also have other things in here as well, but I'm just going to leave it like this. So that is our custom user model. And then also in the documentation, oh yeah, and then also here you can see how they're dealing with this is admin. So right here, they're overriding the is staff property, and then they're returning self.isAdmin. So that way, if they have the isAdmin is true, then isStaff is going to return true. So that's the way they're handling it and why they have this isAdmin, but I'm not a big fan of that approach, so I'm just doing it how I'm doing it. Then at the very bottom, you're going to see the final thing you require, which is this auth user model setting, which is going to be the path to your what's called the custom user model. There you go. I'm gonna copy that, go into my settings.py, paste that in here, and then this is going to be users. That's the name of my app, and then user account is my custom user model because I have user account. So there we go. We now have a custom user model. So now what we can do is Python manage.py make migrations. Sorry, now you're going to see an error when you do this. So auth user model refers to this which has not been installed. So what you have to make sure is whenever you have some kind of model that you want to migrate inside of your app, you're going to want to go into your installed settings. So right here, and just whip in that app. So users in my case. So now when I go to make my migrations, there we go. Create model user account. Perfect. And now I can just migrate these changes over to my SQLite database. So there we go. We apply all of our migrations, which there's also migrations within these apps here, as well as REST Framework and users. So all of that is getting migrated. So I'm gonna clear this up. And then also, by the way, when you make migrations, you have this generated, this 0001 initial pi, where then you can see, was this the initial migration? Does it depend on anything? And then also what operations should it run? So that's what was created. And then when we do the migrate command, it just runs this. Okay, so we're done with that. So in order to actually do things like retrieve our access refresh token and make authorized requests, we're gonna have to make some endpoints. So I'm gonna open up this views.py inside of my user's app. And then this is where I'm gonna be able to do things like create a view for registering the account and also for retrieving the user. All right, so I'm just gonna clear up what's in here. I'm gonna do from REST Framework. I'm gonna import API view. This is something I'm gonna wanna make use of. I'm gonna create a class of register view, which is gonna inherit this API view. And this is going to be a post request. So this is gonna take in self and request. And then for now, I'm just gonna do a pass. So this is one thing I'm gonna need. I'm also gonna need my view which retrieves the user. So for this, I can call it like retrieve user view, pass an API view. This is going to be a GET request that takes in self and request. It's gonna pass for now. And then also remember that our default REST framework settings, they are gonna have a permission classes of allow any. So I want to change that. So I'm gonna do from REST framework, I'm gonna import permissions. And then I'm gonna put in 2 cursors because I'm gonna want this on both of these views. I'm gonna override the permission classes. So permission classes. So this is gonna be a list that's going to take in permissions dot is authenticated. So these are attributes that are part of this API view and just views in general. And then I can set that to whatever permission I want. So by default, it was our allow any. I want to set it to requiring to be authenticated. And actually, this register isn't going to have this now that I'm thinking about this. If we're registering for an account, obviously, we're not logged in. So this is going to be allow any. Retrieving our user is going to be is authenticated. All right, so what are we going to do inside of this register view? So we're going to get some data, which is going to come from request data. So this is going to be our first name, last name, email, and the password. So that's going to be things that we need. And then what we're going to do is we're going to utilize this data and we're going to create a user. So after we successfully create a user, I'm going to return a response. So our logic is going to go right in between here for creating the user. For now, I'm just going to do this response part. So from REST framework dot response, I'm going to import response. So this is going to return some data, and it's also going to have a status code. So for the data, I'll just have some empty data for now and set a status, which is going to be 201 when we create an account. And then what I can also do is I can bring in status, and then instead of doing this 201, which you can do, instead I can do status.htp 201 created. So it's going to be a sort of constant value. And then if you're wondering where you even see these values, how do you even know what to put here? Well, inside of the REST framework documentation, I can go to API guide, status codes, and then here you can see all of them. So here's the 200 level, the 300 level, the 400 level. So all of them are here. Also 500 level. So this is where you can see those particular values. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a serializer. So inside of here, I'm going to have serializers.py. I'm going to have to fix that extension. There we go. So from REST framework, I'm going to import serializers. Then I'm going to create a class, which is going to be my user create serializer. This is going to take in serializers.model serializer. So this is a serializer that's closely tied to the model. So right now we have our user model, and then this is going to make it a lot easier to do sort of like validation around that model. So you can also inherit, let's say, serializers.serializer, and you can specify fields like first name should be things like a character field. So serializers.char fields with a max length of 255 and so forth. But the model serializer makes it so you don't have to do this sort of thing. It's just going to know what fields are part of this user model. So what I can do is I can override this class meta, which is going to have some sort of metadata where I can pass in what I want the model to be. So the model is going to be my custom user model. And then to get my custom user model, I have to do from Django.contrib.auth import get user model. Then I'll set user to be get user model. I'm going to call that. So when you have a custom user model, this is how you can get access to it. And then I can pass that into this model. And then I can also have fields, which I can set to all fields. So I'm going to do all fields for now, just so that you can actually see what fields are part of the actual user model by default. And then I'm just going to save this for now. And then what I'm going to do is inside of, not my models, but inside of my views. So I'm just going to have some logic here to actually create the user. So for now, I'm going to do first name is data first name, last name, email, password. All right, so I have that. Then I'm going to bring in the same sort of import into my views. So I'm going to bring in that get user model, set user equal to get user model. And then what I can do is user.objects.create user. So this is something that I went over. So we have access to that objects, which is that user manager where we overwrote this create user. And then we have to pass in first name, last name, email, and our password to this right here as arguments. So if I open up my models, we can see that. So first name, last name, email, and password is what we pass to this. And that's going to create our user. And then we can do something like set user equal to that. So remember this right here, this method, it returns the user, because right here, we return the user after we save it. And then what I can do is I can use my serializer. So from .serializer, so that's that serializer's file right here, I can bring in my user create serializer. So import user create serializer. Then I can set user equal to user create serializer, pass in user. And then this user, I can just send back the data. So I can do user.data is how I can grab the data from this user. So that way we can actually see the user data. And we're going to be serializing all the fields. So I'm just going to do this for now just so you can see what fields by default are even part of this user model, because it might be a little bit of a mystery. So I'm going to do a python manage.py run server, because now we're ready to run our server. I'm going to open up Postman, which I could have had opened, but it's opening pretty quick. There we go. And then I'm going to make a request to localhost 8000. And then, oh yeah, I need to set an endpoint to this. Yeah, let's do that quickly. So urls.py from Django.urls imports path, and then have URL patterns, which is going to be a list. And make sure to have your spelling exactly like this. Going to have path, and then here I'm going to be making use of that view that we made. So I'm going to import from current directory views my register view. So this is a class-based view. So I also have to chain on the as view and call that. And then I'm going to have the path empty for now. I'm going to have to go into my project urls.py and then create a path, say right here. So API users slash, and then include, which I have to import. And then this right here is going to take an argument, which is a string, which is going to be users.urls. So users is going to be the name of the app, so users.urls. So make sure to have that. I'm going to place my comma and then save that. So my endpoint is going to be API/users/register. So now I'm going to save that, so that'll get rid of the error, or maybe not. Let's see, cannot import name API view. Of course, so I have to go to my views and do .views, because that's where this API view comes from. So I can now go ahead and save that. And you can even see that if, let's say, you open up your virtual environment, lib, and then your REST framework. So right now we have framework.views. So the REST framework.views is this right here. And then inside of here, we have access to that API view. So if I scroll down, there it is, my class of API view. This is where this is coming from. So I can close that up. So that's why we do REST framework.views when we bring this in. All right, so with that, now we have a URL endpoint. So let's test it out. So localhost 8000 API users register. Gonna go ahead, pass in my content type of application JSON. Gonna pass my JSON data in the body. Just gonna take first name. So I'll do John. So last name, Doe, email. So johndoe@gmail.com. And then our password, which I'll set to something like password right now. So we don't have any sort of validation yet. So all I want to do is send this off and show you, whoopsie, this has to be a post request. So I'm going to send that off. And then this right here is what we get back. So when I did inside of my serializer fields all, now we can see some of these default fields because they're a little bit hidden. It's not super obvious because we're doing things like customizing our user model. And then we can add some fields to this thing. So right now we see our first name field that we created. We see the last name field, we see the email field, but we also see some other things. So of course there's an ID. Here's our password. We can see that this right here is not the plain text password, but it's the hashed password. You can see this last login. There's that is super user flag. So that's something that I mentioned. So when we had our custom user model, so right over here, whoop, if I can scroll, there we go. When we did user.isSuperUser equals true, we were dealing with this flag here. We also have things like the isActive, isStaff. We also have this groups and user permissions. So these are all things that are present inside of this abstract base user. So they're part of the actual user, and we can override some things, we can add some things. So that's really what we're doing when we're creating this custom user model. So I'm going to close that up. And then also this right here, I don't want to bring in all the fields, especially, let's say, the password field. You do not want to just have this so easily exposed. Like, you don't want someone going in Postman, sending an API request to your Django backend API, and then being like, oh, there we go, that's the hashed password. Let's now try to brute force this. So you don't want something like that. So instead, for my fields, I'm going to have a tuple, and I'm going to specify, I'm going to have my first name, last name, and email. And then I'm also going to have password here. All right, so this model serializer, it has things that we can override. One of them is the create. So create is going to take in self and validated data. So here we're just going to be passing in our data, which hopefully we validated. And then from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the user. So I can do my user.object.createUser. I can pass it first name is my validated data first name. Then last name, email, and password. And then I'm going to return the user, which I'm going to go ahead and set here. All right, so then this is going to be last name, email, and password. All right, so I'm going to save that. Now I can go back into my views. So right now what I'm doing is I'm creating this user straight here from the view, but I don't need to do that. I can utilize my serializer to do some of these things. So I'm going to remove this import. I'm going to remove this right here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this serializer. All right, so the next thing I'm going to send to this right here is data is equal to, this is going to be a dictionary where I'm going to have my first name, which is going to be first name, and then last name is last name, email is email, and password is password. So this right here is how I can pass this in. But there's an even easier way to do this. So instead of doing this, I already have this data that's in this sort of dictionary format. So instead, I can just do data equals data and just remove all that. So there we go, nice and simple. I'm still getting this little error here, but that's going to be removed in a second. The next thing I want to do is see, are these fields valid? So this is something that the serializer helps us with. So I can do if not serializer.isValid. Then in that case, I can return a response that's going to be an error response. And then I can also do serializer.errors to see those errors and then pass in my status of status.http 400 bad request. All right. So if we pass this validation, then the next thing I'm going to do is create the user. So I can just do user is equal to my serializer.create. And then this serializer.create, let's see what it's going to take. It's going to take in our validated data. So the way I can grab that is serializer.validated data. So the serializer is going to have this right here, which is our validated data. So it does a lot of this stuff for us. And then I can just do user.data. So I'm going to save that, and let's test this out. So right now, if let's say I do something like, actually before I even do that, let's try something like this. So I'm going to send this off. And then we're going to notice is you get email, which is an array, and then enter a valid email address. So the reason for that, of course, is because inside of our models, we have email as an email field, and then this model serializer is going to recognize that the email is supposed to be an email field. So if you don't have model serializer, if you just had serializer, you'd have something like email is serializers.email field. And then in that case, this would help the serializer recognize this is a email field, but with the model serializer, it recognizes the fields in our model and does a lot of things behind the scenes, which is nice and handy. And then we have some other validation too. If I omit one of these, you're also going to have first name. This field is required. Enter a valid email address. I can also leave something blank, send that off. So right now, I can see last name, this field may not be blank, this field is required. So you can see we have a lot of validation done for us, and it's so nice and easy with our Django REST framework. So right now I'm gonna go ahead and re-put in that first name. So John Doe, and then set a valid email. And forgot a comma, there we go. And then I'm going to do an account of, say, John Doe 1, send that off. And whoops, I forgot to do .com. So we're going to send that. And it looks like this ended up failing. So we got an attribute error. And then that's because this right here, what it's returning is not really our serializer. What we would have to actually do is user create serializer, pass in the user, and then this would work appropriately. So I'm going to do John Doe 2 because this actually got created, and I can even see that if I run this. User account with this email already exists. So again, we have validation here, which is nice and handy. So we didn't have to have any logic for seeing does this exist. The reason why it knows to check for that is because this email has a unique equals true. So we also have validation around that. So very, very nice and handy. So right now, what we get back, if we actually do this correctly, so I'll do johndoe2@gmail.com, send that off. So we get the first name, the last name, the email, and the password. So right now we're getting back this password, but I don't really want that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create another serializer. It's going to be quite similar to this one. Instead of user create, I'm going to do user serializer. And then I'm going to copy this, whip it in here. And then I'm just going to remove this password. So this user serializer is going to be nice and simple. It's just going to serialize these three fields. So then back inside of my view, I can bring in my user serializer. And then I can utilize my user serializer here instead of that user create serializer. So what that is going to do for me now, if I create yet another account here, and I send that off, There we go. Now we just get the first name, last name, and email because we're using that user serializer rather than the user create serializer. All right. So this covered quite a few things here. So we still have to do this retrieve user view. But one thing you may have noticed is right here, we have password is password. This is a very simple password, but we did not have any validation here. And then something you might notice, I'm just gonna close up some of this stuff. So inside of our settings.py, if we scroll down, we have some auth password validators here. So we have things like, right here, user attribute similarity validator, minimum length validator, common password validators. So we have all these validators here, but one thing to note with these right here, they don't apply to things like on the model level. So these would be things that would apply for, let's say, if you're doing like your create super user, then you would have these sorts of things apply in that case. But what we have to do is have some more custom validation on the model level. So there is a method right here that's nice and handy for us. And this method is called validate, which will take in self and data. And then this right here, we could have some extra validation. So how do we validate our password? Now Django does have something built in, which isn't the most obvious, but if I open up inside my virtual environment, Django, contrib, auth, inside of here, we have password validation. And then we have validate password. So this thing can take in a password, it can optionally take a user, password validators, and then this is going to validate the password. And then if the password's not valid, it's going to raise a validation error. If it is valid, it's just going to return none. This is the way that this thing works. So what I can do is I can actually import that inside of here. So from Django.contrib.auth. What was it? Password validators? Yeah, password validation actually. I'm going to import that validate password. So now I have access to this thing. So inside of here, when I have something like a try except, because remember this right here, when I call this validate password, passing in the password, it'll either return none if everything's fine, or it's going to raise that validation exception, or sorry, validation error. And then in that case, we're going to accept that exception, and then we can do something with it. So in this case, I can't just pass in password. Instead, I have to do password is equal to data.get password. And then you also saw you could optionally grab that user. So I can do something like user is equal to, and then this should be lowercase. So user is equal to user, and then data. And then I can pass in this user as well. So this is that other optional parameter that you can also pass. So right now I have this accept part. So I want to accept an exception as E. And then in particular, I want that validation exception. So with Django, we also have Django dot, I believe it's core. Yeah, Django.core, we have this exceptions. And then inside of here, there's a pretty handy thing we can do, which is grab this validation error. So I can do from Django.core import validation error, or sorry, import exceptions, and then from exceptions I can have that validation error, and then I can go to right here, and then I can accept exceptions dot validation error, and then I can refer to that as E. So here's another sort of less obvious thing, which is actually very handy for us. So inside of REST Framework, so inside my virtual environment, REST Framework, this is something that's not really on the documentation, at least I didn't see it, but it's actually a pretty handy thing you can do inside of the serializers file. So inside of this file, there's something called as Serializer Error. So this is a global level function, which we can actually import, and as a argument, it takes an exception. So it's going to take that exception. What it's going to go ahead and return for us is an object, which is going to be API settings.nonfield errors key. So what this thing is if we go inside of our, where is it? Settings. And then if we scroll down a little bit, we're going to see, if I can find it. Oh yeah, non-field errors key. So this thing is just the string non-field errors. So these are just like general errors. And then back inside of the serializers, so API settings.nonfield errors is literally just going to be that string of non-field errors. And then we're going to have an array with this detail thing, which is going to be an array of our errors. So this is a nice handy function that takes in that exception and returns us a dictionary that will have non-field errors and then the list of errors. So that's something that we can make use of. So that's another thing we're going to import. And actually I have access to it right in here with serializers. So I can do serializer errors. I'm going to have a variable which is going to be serializers.as serializer error, because that's what this thing is called, as serializer error. And then I'm going to pass in E. So E is just what I'm referring to this thing as. And then from here, I can have this validate. It can raise exceptions dot validation error. And then here, I can have a dictionary with the password key, and it's going to be my serializer errors. And then I'm going to access that non-field errors key. So that key is going to be the exact same as this value here. So non-field errors I'm accessing right here, and that's going to be my array of errors. So this validate is going to raise this, and then we're going to actually have this right here, which we're going to pass back inside of a response. All right, so some pretty advanced stuff here, but right now what this did for us is that if, let's say, I now go ahead and try to create a new account, send this off, here we now get that password with our array. This password is too common. Or I can just pass in like P, let's say, and now we get this. So this password is too short, it must contain at least 8 characters, this password is too common. So right now we have a very proper sort of registration going on here. Now there are libraries that would do a lot of this stuff for you, so you don't actually have to create this sort of stuff from scratch, but I thought it'd be interesting to sort of show how you could do this from scratch. And now I'm gonna just close up a lot of these things I opened up. All right. So the last thing I'm gonna do is just finish up this retrieve user view, and then I'm gonna wrap up this video, which is pretty long already. So the retrieve user view, pretty straightforward. We're just gonna be retrieving the user from request.user. I wanna serialize this user, so user serializer, pass in the user, and then just return a response. And of course we can retrieve this user because our permission classes is authenticated inside of here. Then I can do user.data, I can return that, I can return a status, which I'm just gonna have as an HTTP, 200 OK, and there we go. Now the last thing I have to do is just create an endpoint for this to handle this view. So back in here, I'm gonna import this, I'm gonna copy down a line, and then for the endpoint, I'm gonna have API/users/me, and then this will utilize this retrieve users view. This retrieve users view will handle a get request. We're gonna retrieve the user. You have to make sure to pass an authorization header in order to actually hit this. And then we're gonna serialize that user, return it in a response that's a 200 OK. So that's all that's gonna happen. So let's test that out. Gonna have a get request, localhost 8000, API users me, and then I'm going to have the authorization header. And then if I don't send that, I'm going to get detail authentication credentials were not provided with a 401 unauthorized. So I'm going to have to send that off. So authorization bearer followed by my access tokens. Remember, this is the auth header type. I can have different auth header types. I can I can override this particular value to be something else, but I was just using the default, which I mentioned before. And now how do we get our access token? Well, remember we set up those endpoints with the Django REST Framework, simple JWT. So those were these 3 endpoints here. So when I hit this endpoint with a post request, and then I'm gonna have to pass in my username field. So that's going to be, if I open up my users models, the username field, which in my case is email. So I'm gonna have to do email and also the password. So I'm gonna pass that in a post request to this endpoint, and that'll return me the access and refresh token. And then with the access token, I can make my authorized requests. So let's do that. Post request, localhost 8000 API token slash. Make sure to have that trailing slash. And if you don't want that trailing slash, then just remove it from here. But Django does expect trailing slashes because that's by default in Django. And if you actually go into the Django documentation and then settings. So there is a setting for this. I forget what it's called. So it is called append slash. So by default, Django has this set to true, which is to append slashes. So when set to true, if the request URL does not match any of the patterns in the URL conf and it doesn't end in a slash, an HTTP redirect is issued to the same URL with a slash appended. Note that the redirect may cause any data submitted in a post request to be lost. So yeah, this setting here is why you need the trailing slashes. So the key point here is, and it doesn't end in a slash. So if your URL endpoint doesn't end in a slash, there will be a redirect which will be issued to the same URL with the slash appended. So you need to make sure when you're sending the request, it'll have the slash. Otherwise, you can set this to be false. Because if I were to just issue it like this, I can do a quick test. So I'll do content type. Then the body, raw, email. And then here I'll do the John Doe at gmail.com. And then password. Also, I'm gonna have to set more secure passwords. So I already made this account with the password before I did the validation, so this should actually work. Oh, or I guess not. Was it this one? Okay, I don't remember anymore, so I'm just gonna go ahead and create a brand new account. So I'm gonna use the register endpoint. And then I'm just gonna do this johndoe4@gmail.com. And then for the password, I'll do something like programming is fun. Gonna send that off. Looks like I'm getting an assertion error. So why is that? Validate should return the validated data. Yes, so I should have, inside of my serializers, done a return data. So that's gonna return the validated data. So there we are. So now with that, I can go ahead and send this off. Still getting an assertion error. Why is that? And then of course I'm getting that because I forgot to save the file. So let's try that again. There we go. So now I get this back. This is now created. So now I can do programming is fun. This is my John Doe 4. Send that off. And now we're getting a error, which is a 500 internal server error. So here we actually run into a runtime error. And then this error is around that append slash setting that I was mentioning. So you call this URL via post, but the URL doesn't end in a slash, and you have append slash set. So Django can't redirect to the slash URL while maintaining post data. So change your form to point to localhost 8000 API token slash, note the trailing slash, or set append slash to false in your Django settings. So that's why we got this 500 internal server error. So in that case, I can just add in that slash, and then that's going to fix the issue. And there we go. But now we get no active account found with the given credentials. Interesting. I thought I registered this one. So that probably means I put in the wrong password. So I'm just gonna copy this and then go back here. Oh yeah, I did programming is run. So at least that tested if the password's wrong. So now I can send this off. Now we get the refresh access token. So now for the final test of this video, I'm gonna grab this guy. I'm gonna go to my retrieve endpoint here. Then I'm gonna have that bear and then the access token as my authorization header. So previously we got this right here because we didn't have the authorization header. Now that we do have that, there we go. We just retrieve our user data. So perfect. So that is now all set up. So we now have full authentication in this app. So I'm just gonna close some of this up, do a quick summary of what we covered. So we looked at creating the custom user model. Here's the model. We also had the user manager where I showed you how to override these things here. And then we also have this create super user. So one thing I'll show you very quick here is if I were to just comment this out and save. So right now, if I do a Python manage.py create super user, I can put in an email. And then, whoops, this is already taken. So I'll do something like Bryan@gmail.com. There we go. So I'll do Bryan, done. And then if I do password of password, this password is too common. And then I can either bypass that or no. So maybe I can just do P. This password is too short. It must contain at least 8 characters. This password is too common. So as you can see, we're not doing any of this, but inside of our settings, like I mentioned before, we have these auth password validators. So these are working when we do something like create our super user. But when we were just creating our normal user, we had to do this because those settings weren't being applied on the model level. So I just wanted to demonstrate that real quick. So I'll just do no, and actually I'll just exit out of that. I just wanted to demonstrate that. I'm not actually gonna be making use of a super user, so I just won't even create one, but just wanted to quickly showcase that. So anyway, we had our custom user model with our user account manager where we had the override for the create user and the create super user, where the create super user will just set these 2 flags so that we can log into the admin panel and also make certain adjustments inside of there to any data that we register in there, which we would do through these admin.py files, which I'm not going to be doing in this particular project. And then from there, we hooked up a serializer, and then we had our user create serializer, where we grabbed our model serializer. We hooked it up, well, we hooked up the model to be our user model. We also had the fields. Now, the password fields on the default user of Django, it doesn't have some of the validation that we may want. We actually have to set that ourselves, which is why we also define this validate. So this validate is something we overwrote to also go ahead and validate our password, because our serializer is going to validate our other fields properly, because they're just basic character fields and an email field, but this password field, we wanted some extra validation on it. So our data, the other ones are fine. The character field, email field is just this password field. We wanted something extra, and then we just return. And then we also defined create. This is another method inside of the model serializer, so we're overriding that. We're just passing in user is going to be user objects create user, passing in all of our validated data, because as a parameter, this will expect to receive the validated data. So we just have validated data. That's what we called it here, just to make it clear. This is our validated data. That's how the serializer works. And then we just simply return that user, which we have a reference to, because of course this create user in our models returns the user after we create it and save it. All right, and then we also created a serializer here, which will just return these 3 fields, because this one here is dealing with these 4 fields. And also this one, I wanted to more just before this whole creation of the user. So we got that. And then we also have our URLs. So in here we have the REST Framework simple JWT URLs. So we tested the token one. There's also the refresh one where we can send our refresh token, get back a new access token. We also have the verify one where we can verify whether our access token is legitimate. So that'll be things like, is the email password correct? Is the expiration date valid? Things like that. If it's not valid, it'll send back a 400 bad request. And then we also created some of our own custom endpoints, which are inside of here. So API users register, API users me. And then this one will utilize this class-based view. This one utilizes this one, where our register one is simply just going to get our data. It's going to go ahead and go through this user create serializer. Then this user create serializer is going to do our validation. We can check if is valid is true. So are all the fields valid? If so, we're going to continue on. If they're not valid, we're just going to return an error response, passing back whatever this serializer had as its errors. And then we're going to go ahead. If the fields are valid, we're going to just do serializer.create. And then we can do serializer.validatedData to grab the validated data. And then this right here is just going to return the user, which we're going to serialize using our user serializer. Then we're going to pass it back in response. User.data is going to be that serialized data from this serializer. And we're going to have a 201 created status code. And then finally, we have this view where we set the permission classes. We need to be authorized to make this request. We're going to retrieve the user making the request. From the request, we have this user. We can serialize them, send them back. And there we go. So that'll cover what I wanted to do in this video. And then in our next video, that's where we're going to start hooking up our front end. So that's going to be where we have our React application being served by Express. And then we're also going to have Redux Toolkit, which is going to manage our global state management. So there we are. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to leave a like to help that YouTube algorithm recommend this video to others. And then also hit that subscribe button. If you want, you can hit the notification bells, but I'm sure you have enough notifications in your life already. And there you go. That'll be everything for this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.